In the name of God, most merciful, most compassionate, I welcome you to the last session today, which deals with the U.S. security and regional challenges. We have Dr. Rory Miller from Georgetown, Dr. Dhafer Al Ajmi, and Dr. Mahjoob Zweiri from Qatar University. We'll start with first of all, we start with Dr. Dhafer Al Ajmi. You have 15 minutes.
دول الخليج العربي في القدرات الأمريكية لخلق التوازن الإقليمي.
مايك.
راح أعدل ورقة على أساس إن الوقت ما يسرقني بدل ما أسترسل ويصير تداعيات بين الوقت. اكتشف العالم.
There's a problem. Mike, there's a problem. There's a problem with, yeah.
فهناك شعوب لديها قابلية الغزو.
This comes from different sources of invasion. Invasion can be Western, can be Iranian, can be Iraqi. With the passage of time, the collective consciousness of the Gulf countries has become used to this way of thinking, and the Gulf people started accepting the parameters set by the invaders. And in that case, we will be faced with people ready and susceptible to be invaded. This ability and readiness for in the Gulf people to be invaded is largely due to American policy when the Obama administration started steering away. When President Trump came to power and started dealing with war as a commercial enterprise. And this has impacted the strategic balance in the Gulf area, and this is evident from observing the role Washington has previously played in maintaining this balance of power, and whether or not the Gulf countries still rely on the American role, and to what extent the events in the area impact the area itself, especially in view of the fact that Iran is returning gradually to the scene. Of course, we have to first understand that each country needs to be able to muster strength and capabilities to be able to deter any threats against it in order to reach a state of stability. There were other entities who passed through this experience apart from Gulf countries, but they managed to restore the balance of power, and the Gulf countries could have done that and maintain the strategic balance with Iran, for example, through taking their own steps, especially at the military cooperation level and the preemptive, the abilities to preempt any strikes against them. Secondly, to build unified structures enabling smaller entities to gain strength, and this way, this collective coordination will enable a group of smaller countries to stand up and face challenges constituted by other powers. And also, there is the other dimension of being able to gain protection through relying on a nuclear umbrella by an ally or developing your own nuclear capabilities, and this will lead to a balance based on some sort of an arrangement like the SALT agreement or similar arrangements. The American role, a large part of the 20th century was nothing but about American values and biographies of American presidents, which made it an American century par excellence. Of course, there was President Nixon when he stood up to the Soviet and communist expansion, and successive administrations relied on the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine, which linked the security of the Gulf to the national security of the United States, because the Gulf was a vital interest for the United States, and because the neighboring regions were in conflict, and there is linkage also to arms deals and energy supplies, which made America find justifications for its presence in the Gulf, especially after the liberation of Kuwait, and also especially in view of the arms race between Iran and the Gulf countries in the last 2 decades. When Iran sought to acquire nuclear weapons, distorted the balance of power. Winston Churchill said that the Americans did not use the right methods to find the right solutions until they exhausted all the wrong ways of trying to find a solution. And we look at President Obama, which is based on certain degree of opportunism, and in his when Trump came to power, the American administration started developing a new strategy through going beyond the Obama Doctrine and preparing the way to a return of an alliance between the Gulf and the United States. The current administration's view is more in line with that of the strategic view of the Gulf countries to face up to Iranian challenges and threats jointly. Maybe the American military presence will be lessened gradually in accordance to Trump's policy. The 21st American century, the American century expression came into existence in 1941 to bring America out of its isolation and to be the main player in the balance of power. So has Washington given up on its role? Joseph May says American withdrawal as a concept can be complete or partial. The complete withdrawal can mean the other side winning, but the partial or proportional withdrawal can happen as a result of the other countries achieving more development than the United States, and not due to internal reasons within the United States. 21st century started while America remaining at the forefront and for reasons to do surely with the size of the United States and its need for energy supplies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And now we give the floor to Dr. Rory to present his paper, where he will talk about. So it's going to be the U.S. Gulf strategic and security relations in an era of uncertainty. So the floor is yours.
There's no little irony in the fact that the most explicit U.S. acknowledgement in the last 40 years of the value of the GCC as a regional security actor has occurred at a time when the two most powerful members of that organization, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have abandoned it. And it's also been made by a U.S. administration that's been repeatedly indifferent, if not outright hostile, to the idea of regional organizations and international institutions. And what I want to do here briefly today is use the Trump administration's championing of the GCC in the context of the blockade of Qatar as a starting and an endpoint to look at what I consider to be an under-examined issue in the large literature that exists on U.S. Gulf relations, the role of the GCC as a security actor in the relationship with the U.S. My own area of expertise is small state security and regional security rather than U.S. Gulf relations. But I've often thought that for all its limitations in those terms, the GCC has played a valuable role as a defensive security actor in a contested region. Obviously, the dominant perception and reality is of Arab Gulf states unable to provide their own security and then attempting to deal with the anarchic international system by embracing great power protection as a key pillar of the security. That's a given. And this has created a reluctance to invest political capital, if not financial surpluses, in developing alternative bilateral and multilateral relations. And it's also facilitated the avoidance of the difficult task of proactively developing an autonomous regional security capability. But beyond that, there is other things to think in terms of. You know, the end of the Iran-Iraq war and the 1990-91 Kuwait crisis underscored the new preeminence of the United States as an international security actor. But more importantly, in the context of what I'm looking at, it demonstrated that a consensus could be reached on critical regional security issues between the newly crowned unipolar power and local partners. During the 1990s, this didn't happen too much. You know, under the policy of dual containment with the Clinton administration, you see a heavy military presence in this region, underscoring the strategic limitations, the manpower limitations, the lack of mature institutions on a regional level, on a security level. Also, this underscored the common perception that's held up today that regional organizations really do not often have a mandate in peace and security. Fewer still have a desire to act as offensive security actors beyond their home region, to undertake peace enforcement, for an example. There's also a prejudice, I guess you could say, that the proliferation of regional organizations is an indication of insecurity rather than security, that endangers and is an obstacle to external actors and their local allies achieving their security objectives. At the same time, most of the literature, as you all know, views the GCC as a weak actor in regional security. Having failed to institutionalize its security cooperation or build an integrated military, which I think is a little harsh when you compare it to other regional organizations too. And it's also another factor for this lack of focus on this issue is that, you know, it is obviously a case of realist regional cooperation, and under neo-realism, with its emphasis on structure, the balance of power mechanism of security governance rests on the idea of an international system composed of competing power centers. And security systems on this basis do not always require formal institutions like regional organizations. What they need is an effective balance of power. So all of these reasons have militated against looking seriously at this function, even though it hasn't been a terribly unsatisfactory one. The other consideration before I get into it is that in the 2000s, the nature of threats has changed. from traditional state threats like Saddam invading Kuwait and to more non-traditional, non-state-based threats. And what you see in this environment, regional security managers have been found it much more difficult to agree to a consensus position with Washington on critical security issues. Especially, I would argue, over whether evolving threats in this region require novel offensive and preventative responses or more traditional defensive ones. And differences on this vital matter, as the previous speaker said, are compounded by rising skepticism over the nature of American power, the legitimacy of its foreign policy actions and strategic goals, and a growing perception that the power differential between the United States and its main competitors is shrinking. So these two tensions have also created tensions in the relationship. And one critical aspect of these tensions is struggle to find a consensus on the role of the GCC as a key component of regional security. Now it goes without saying, and all of you will notice, the United States has never provided a formal security guarantee or treaty obligation to any of the Gulf states in the military sphere. But it has often made a de facto and public acknowledgement that their interests were similar and that they would act on the basis. You have many examples of this. Speaking in Doha in 2010, Secretary of State Clinton said that the Gulf states had 3 alternative ways of dealing with the threat of Iran. They could surrender, they could find a way of dealing with themselves, or in her opinion, a much better option, they could work closely under the United States umbrella. Now, this absence of a formal guarantee, but one based on, you could call a promise, has not really incentivized regional action. What you really have seen is that despite acknowledging the limitations of the GCC as a regional actor, successive presidencies have still prioritized for their own interests bilateral relations. In the 1990s, under the policy of dual containment, the priority of the Clinton administration was building up rapid deployment capabilities through bilateral relations, not on a regional level. Now, this explicit, though informal U.S. commitment to bilateral security has diminished the incentive for autonomous developments. And at the same time, you can identify what I would call selective multilateralism in the region. From the Reagan administration all the way up until Obama, and also the Trump administration. Now this raises one question. If bilateral security cooperation satisfies the interests of the United States as a dominant actor, why would it invest any political or security effort at all in building a regional capability, even a modest one? Especially if the dominant actor is concerned that a regional model might militate against its own interests in the region. You know, different security mechanisms and security conflicts can transform into a security community over the longer term, and such a scenario, even though unlikely, does pose the problem that member states of a robust regional organization may use the framework to come to terms with local partners, even if it goes against the interests of the external actor. The other point I would make out is that even if the dominant external actor does not proactively look to build up the regional military capability, it may do so unintentionally. For example, if providing bilateral security and security shelter provides member states of the organization the safety and the time to develop their identity and legitimacy, this could indirectly consolidate the security capability of the regional organization. And from a neoliberal perspective, in which regional organizations are a gradual process of institution building, the dominant actor's role in carrying out security for the smaller partners, even indirectly, can be an important contribution to building regional institutions. And again, it goes without saying that the dominant actor may also, and in this case the United States has done, proactively at times encourage regional actors to move together in the security sphere so that they can take more regional responsibility, viewing bloc building as a way to balance the system, and an important instrument for the external actor to achieve its regional goals. And again, I don't have time to go into it, but one can trace some evidence of this from the Reagan administration all the way up to the present administration. Now, the other point I would make is that if you have a more complex conception of security and national interest than just realist power balance, and if external threats are viewed to be just one of many challenges in a region, then you have an incentive for the dominant external actor to facilitate regional cooperation. And one interesting evidence of this is the 2010 US National Security Strategy, which endorsed the idea of building security ties with regional organizations, and I'm quoting, because they're particularly effective at mobilizing and legitimating cooperation on a whole range of problems. And in line with such thinking, the Obama administration in particular looked to reach what I would call, and what has been called, a workable balance between traditional bilateral cooperation and a more GCC-centric security architecture. And of course, the 2010 National Security document explicitly references the GCC in these terms, but I don't have time to go into it. There were also many calls during the Obama administration for more engagement with regional partners. And on one level, these proposals were an attempt to try to reassure local partners, very disillusioned, as the previous speaker said, with the Obama's Middle East policies, reassure them that the United States had their interests in mind. However, I would argue it's also part of a long-term process that you can trace in U.S. strategic thinking that places a significant value, if secondary value, in regional cooperation. Again, Obama's 2015 National Security Strategy expressed this in very cost-benefit terms. U.S. investment at a regional level in the Gulf, it said, was in our interest because long-term stability required regional cooperation. And again, I don't have time to go in, but you see this most clearly in the context of counterterrorism and missile defense. And I'm happy to deal with that in a bit more detail subsequently. One of the most important explicit statements of this, and there's one almost every year of Obama's second term, 2012, 14, 15, but one was the 2013 presidential determination on the GCC, which among other things said that where possible, the United States should prioritize weapons and technology transfer to the GCC as a unified bloc rather than as individual partners. Now, obviously, taking missile defense, as you will all know, this is much more of a requirement than just technical integration or coordination of defense spending. It requires local actors who have shared vision of the benefits, be able to cooperate politically, and a willingness to cede some national sovereignty. Which brings us to the final point I want to make, which is the Arab Gulf perspective on this wider issue. Even the most integrated regional organizations are basically meeting places for member states. They do not have a centralized supranational capacity to control security. And as such, their security choices reflect the preferences of their member states, not as the regional organization as a whole. So in these terms, the real primary explanation for the failure of the GCC to evolve is the choices of its member states. And I would argue also one of the most important explanations for this is that the fear that the regional organization, the GCC, would serve ultimately as an instrument for the assertion of dominance by Saudi Arabia. And of course, Saudi Arabia had many failed attempts from the 1980s until 2011 and then 2014 to try to create a security mechanism in the GCC under its direction and control. The rejection of the Riyadh Declaration at the end of 2011 is one example. And you see some quite stark criticisms of the other member states by Saudi King Abdullah when they did reject that, warning them that they would be left behind if they didn't follow the position of the Saudis. And then, of course, you see even less tolerance, willingness to tolerate this under the new leadership after 2015. Now, Saudi Arabia has been traditionally a cautious security actor, but post-Bahrain in 2011, you see a turning point. And I would argue that in its growing vision and willingness to project power in a more offensive way, the GCC has been one of the main casualties. Because in the past, in my opinion, the GCC's main successes have been defensive. It's been able to chisel out a pretty effective united response to crises in 91, 2001, 2003, and make the best of a bad situation. To diffuse internal crises before they escalated or were militarized, which is a pretty impressive achievement too. It's been coherent enough on some level to keep Iran in check with the cooperation of the United States, but never strong enough to threaten or antagonize Iran too greatly. And what you see very clearly is that in the post-Arab Spring era, these important, if not hugely impressive achievements have been not enough for ambitious policymakers in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to adopt or embrace or pursue. What they want instead is to pursue an offensive security approach, and this frustration with the GCC has been compounded by a growing disillusion that I mentioned with the United States. And in conclusion, one of the main consequences of this has been the establishment of Saudi-UAE axis of informal multilateral security coalitions in Yemen, the underwhelming Islamic Terror Coalition that was launched in December 2015, and the Anti-Qatar Coalition of June of 2017. These appeal to the UAE and Saudi Arabia because they're not rule-based like the GCC, and they avoid one major constraint of the GCC, the strict conditions for admission and entry. And that has prevented its expansion as a security actor in response to specific challenges. Now, as you know, in the first year of the Trump presidency, it seemed to embrace this new offensive, proactive approach, both in its relationship with the Saudi leadership and in the battlefield in Yemen, and in providing military supplies to the UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. But the breach with Qatar was also a conscious decision to abandon the GCC. And it's this outcome, rather than the embargo itself, that the US has a major issue with, which I think is an important point. You know, we all know President Trump has recently, since January, called extensively for the blockade to end because it hurts strong, united local GCC cooperation. But the December 2017 National Security Strategy, the first major security document of the Trump administration, was clear. And this is in the middle of the boycott of the blockade. The US commitment is to a strong and integrated GCC. And then, of course, you have the statements by Secretaries Mattis and then Tillerson at the meeting with the Qataris and the dialogue in Washington in January. You have the testimony before Congress of the head of Central Command in March. All share one thing in common, a restatement of the importance of the GCC as a security partner as the key reason why the blockade is problematic for the United States. You know, Votel, the head of Central Command, described it as the most significant complicating factor in American relations in the wider region. And then, of course, Pompeo, both in bilateral discussions with the Saudis and in multilateral discussions about building a new security alliance, he has also linked the future GCC to the security of the Gulf. Now, the final point I want to make is that this US backing is a major blow to the Saudi-UAE vision for the region's future security architecture. It is undermined primarily the UAE-Saudi claim that the proactive militarization and escalation of conflicts, coupled with the abandonment of the GCC, is the best way forward for Gulf American interests. In doing so, it has reminded us all of the long-time effectiveness of the GCC, in my opinion, in a contested and dangerous region. And while I do not think that the GCC is going to return and even achieve what it achieved in the past, I think what you see is a huge vacuum opening because of the underestimation up until now of the role that it played. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. الآن ننتقل للدكتور محجوب الزبيري.
We move to Dr. Mahjoob al-Zweiri. He will be talking about the Iranian role in Gulf-US relations. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for the kind invitation by the Arab Center. When talking about the Iranian role in U.S. Gulf relations, I'll be alluding to 5 basic variables which have developed in the last 5 years, and Iran had something to do with them. When Ahmadinejad left and Hassan Rouhani came to power, that was variable number 1. Secondly, the nuclear deal between the 5+1 in Iran, which was cancelled by the Trump administration some 3 years later. Then a Democratic president left the White House and a Republican one came to power, and by that I mean President Trump, who focused on Iran all the way through his campaign. Then when King Abdullah died and his brother King Salman replaced him with his son Muhammad bin Salman as crown prince, and also the blockade of Qatar. Very briefly, I'll discuss these 5 variables. First of all, there is an American exploitation of the Iranian role even before President Trump came to power, and by that I mean President Obama, who signed a nuclear deal which was understood by almost all Gulf countries as America neglecting the American anxieties towards Iran. And you remember the invitation to Camp David and the summit meeting with the Gulf leaders. This brings into play an important issue, and that is when the United States decided to sign the nuclear deal, neither consulted the Gulf countries nor took them into consideration, and this has annoyed the Saudis, who thought they'll have no future in their relations with the US for as long as Barack Obama was in power. The second important variable was that at the beginning of the period I'm talking about, there was an Omani mediation between Iran and the United States, meaning that Oman has taken a different path in its approach, and the Saudis did not see eye to eye with Oman in this, because they see Iran as a threat to its vital interests. And also we notice what I call the division within the GCC was enhanced, in fact. So when we're talking about nowadays divisions within the GCC community, this is not new. This happened in the past, and in the last 5 years we saw that evidently Oman's position in mediating between the US and Iran. We also saw another change in that period. We saw that the United States, when a Democratic president was replaced by a Republican president, the opposite happened. America moved closer to the Gulf countries at the expense of Iran, and mainly with Saudi Arabia, because in the Gulf countries there is differences when it comes to the way they view Iran. If we take first of all the approach of challenging and threats, some call Iran a threat, some call it a challenge, and definitely the United States is aware of this, because it must be hearing that from its diplomatic sources. Maybe what the headline Saudi position is not echoed necessarily in Oman or the UAE. So this division within the GCC countries vis-a-vis Iran made America say that there is no unified position within the GCC that the US can rely on, and which should be taken into consideration when America weighs up its interests with Iran or the Gulf. For this reason, recently we noticed that there was a deepening of this division vis-a-vis Iran, and we saw how Iran on its part was investing in Saudis in stakes, and the last of which, of course, is the Khashoggi killing and what happened in Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Iran managed to the Trump administration, either directly or indirectly, to give an exception to 8 countries to be exempted from the sanctions that no way the Trump administration was thinking of doing. The Trump administration repeatedly said that on the 6th of November there will be a new sanctions regime announced with no exceptions until they had to give this exception to 8 countries, including Turkey, India, and South Korea, I think. This made Iran think that it can move things rather quickly in its own direction and give Iran the edge at a time when these concessions were not thought of a few weeks earlier. The United States, when it was talking about the sanctions imposed on Iran, was expecting from the Gulf countries to participate in these sanctions. In other words, it wanted Saudi Arabia to increase its oil production to compensate for the loss of Iranian exports. And also they wanted to weaken the trade exchange, which is at 17%, and they wanted Doha to lessen the contacts with Iran and also try to pressurize Oman and Kuwait. This means that the Trump administration decided to go ahead with the sanctions on Iran regardless of the position of the Gulf countries, and it wanted the Gulf countries to increase tension against Iran despite the fact that Iran is a neighbor of these countries. At the essence of all these events lies the role of Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia heads the idea of demonizing Iran increasingly, and it wants from the Trump administration, because it sees in the Trump administration a historic opportunity to weaken Iran economically, maybe in the hope of pushing it towards collapse if possible. In view of this context, the presence of the Iranian factor in the U.S.-Gulf relations in the ongoing Gulf crisis, which started with the blockade of Qatar in 2017, please note two important factors. First of all, the Iranian factor was brought into play by the 4 countries imposing the blockade on Qatar, because they wanted to convince the U.S. that the relations between Qatar and Iran is a problem. And the Trump administration on its part has been focusing on other issues within the Gulf crisis, like combating terrorism or maintaining the cohesion of the GCC, because the US didn't want to do anything with Iran because the relations between the US and Iran is limited anyway, without the additional element of the Gulf crisis. Also, we notice that Turkey was pushed into this equation to give the impression that this was not a sectarian issue, and any player, any regional player can be treated in a manner similar to how Iran was treated, and maybe this found favor within the American administration, because its relations with Turkey was in turmoil already before this issue. And what is worth mentioning when talking about the Iranian factor, there was always a view that the Iranian factor was more dynamic, and the Iranians were always, they had the initiative and they used to lead the way. And the American administration, different administrations, were always of the opinion that Iran is a proper nation state, which is something that does not apply to Gulf countries, and those Gulf countries cannot really defend their interests or express them in a way similar to how Iran is able to. And maybe this has something to do with the fact that the Iranian role will always have a dynamic presence in the U.S. Gulf relations, and both sides cannot deal with it decisively, and yet they always bring it into play, because the United States has not been decisive over 40 years in dealing with Iran, and this opened the way for more political and economic blackmail. I'll conclude by saying with this continuing situation of blackmail, we see how the United States has been turning a blind eye to the Iranian role in Yemen, and incidentally the so-called the Saudi campaign in Yemen, Iran did not have any interest in Yemen. Iran entered Yemen in 1990-1991 in the days of Ali Abdullah Saleh because of Ali Abdullah Saleh's position and support of Saddam Hussein. Yemen is not present in the Iranian calculations, so therefore trying to play in Saudi's backyard, which is Yemen, came because Iran was not ready for it in the past, and even when they tried to deal with the Houthis and deal with them, the Iranians couldn't succeed because they're not familiar with the Houthi discourse and the tribal attitudes. Yet they tried to use the security of the water lanes and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits and their trade passing through that. This was their entry point into this crisis or involvement by saying that they have interest in Yemen. In fact, their interest in Yemen is to do more with their competition with Saudi Arabia, and the Iranians have always said that they're willing to deal with the Europeans and help mediate, solve that crisis in return for concessions. Maybe if relations between Tehran and Riyadh were sorted out, Iran's attitude towards the Yemen would change. Finally, whenever the American or the Gulf side fails, the Iranian side wins. And we noticed lately that even from Riyadh there were many mistakes being committed, and it happened maybe 6 strategic mistakes or blunders by the Saudis since 2015, including the crisis with Canada. And one country was responsible for, but the United States tried to intervene. The last of these mistakes was the blockade on Qatar. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all speakers for their speeches, very invaluable contributions, and they have dwelled on very important issues, and we think this will stimulate questions, so we'll open the floor for anybody who has a question. I would like to remind you of 2 points. Anybody who has a question, we invite them to introduce themselves, and it seems that when you finish speaking or asking, please turn off the mic so as not to cause any technical challenges. So we'll start with the gentleman from there. Please be on you, and thank you very much, Sheikh Suhaim, and the speakers. I think this is very important, very
فيه مدخل ثقافي فكري
There is a cultural, intellectual
برنامج تعاطي في قضايا الخليج.
point to the issues related to the Gulf countries. Researchers who are concerned with the Gulf region and the Arab region, we follow the same
ومن قبلها من بدء الغزو الغربي للخليج 1504 للميلاد في عهد البرتغالي.
This started from the Portuguese invasion and how to deal with the Gulf region. Is it a part of the Arab world or a separate entity? And I will come back to this point at the end of my interjection because I don't have a question, but I would like to shed light on this kind of thinking and its impact on the strategic situation in the Gulf region. Yes, this project and these relations deep in history focused on that. The United States do provide protection to the Gulf areas. When the fact is contrary to that, it increased the tension and it just preventing the war to come to the outskirts of the GCC countries. So we need to think about a very important issue when we talk about concerns and when the threat of reached the inside of the GCC, we cannot ignore that what has took place on the 5th of June and the Emir of Kuwait had dwelled on that, and Mr. Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, when his interview with Bloomberg, he said our concern is to prevent any military action in the Gulf region or against any other Gulf country. So this is a fundamental issue, how to move to the ratification mentality. As researchers, we are encountering a very important responsibilities. However, we still have a problem with the way our leaders adopt. So, however, I will try to draw 3 tracks. The first one is the strategic security in the region, and here we are not claiming that the area will be able to counter the Western countries. However, I think it's very important to come up with the regional balance here, and this meaning that the countries pushed us or forced us to adopt this balance in power. The second issue is toppling this weak and lame entity, namely GCC, will ensure protection and security. Unfortunately, no. So I think it's very important to address the weaknesses in the GCC as an entity and find remedies to its weaknesses. The third point, and we need to think that the political reform in the area played a role in this immature decision taken by some of the leaders of the GCC countries. So I go back to the issue of ايش العروبة؟ ايش كلمة العروبة؟ The concept of the pan-Arab region. We know in the past Oman was the anchor in terms of the strength of the area. So we need to alleviate the role of Oman to counter this bipolarism in the area and to stood against the ambitions of Saudi Arabia, who want to dominate the region.
I ask Mr. Miller, I have 2 questions. Is American power still as usual? Is American power still as usual? Or there is a lack of it in the new administration of America right now? Let's follow. Is America still fighting for its values like democracy, justice, equality, and so on. Thank you. This for you. الأخ محجوب.
My question to Dr. Mahjoob Zweiri. The nuclear deal with Iran. Can we say that when the United States signed the nuclear deal, is this a sign that the U.S. is abandoning its allies in the Gulf region? My name is Abdul Ghilani from Oman. The security issue is a very complicated, very complex issue. And we have to address the root causes of this security problem. Otherwise, we'll be meeting in such gatherings and such symposiums for a long, long time without reaching any solutions. The problem lies in the fact that the Gulf region is exposed at the security level. No one country can defend its security and provide protection with its existing power. Yes, they are exposed against everybody here. So we need to, again, to address the root causes. For instance, if we take Iran as an example, there is an absence of a common strategic vision vis-a-vis the opportunities and threats. Some look at Iran as a strategic partner, others who believe that Iran is a source of threat. So the prevailing, there is no governing body or framework that identify or determine the opportunities and the threats vis-a-vis the relations with Iran. So, as I said, we are dealing with political regimes in the area, especially those who are escalating their policies, like Saudi Arabia and UAE. So, are we dealing with political regimes that lacks strategic thinking, and accordingly, the foreign relations vis-a-vis the relations with Iran and what's happening in strategic thinking by the regime or the leaders, which cause a hefty price. So, again, unless the Gulf countries embark on real reforms and involve its people in the reform, yes, we have to take as a fact that the leaderships are legitimate and so are calling for reforms in the framework of an alignment with the existing authorities here. But again, the people in the area must be involved in these reforms and to put us to this reckless political ambitions of some of the countries.
Muhammad Sharqawi, I have one observation on methodology and the concepts, and please do not accuse me of being either vague or too optimistic. We talk about the Gulf or the Gulf issues, treating it as if it's still one cohesive unit, and we also talk about the American position or thinking as if there is only one unified position that Washington views this area with. I fear that we are here making a mistake, trying to be historically correct. Can't we now talk about more than one Gulf? There is a Gulf of the Saudi and the UAE. There is another Gulf which is Qatari, Omani, and Kuwaiti. There is a Gulf which is the Persian Gulf. So how can this division impact on the affairs of the Gulf as a region and the methodology with which we try to analyze the events in this part of the world? Some observations outside the box. I heard about the Iranian nuclear threat, but I have not heard about the Israeli nuclear threat. I heard about dialogue with the Israelis and meet dialogue with our cousins, the Qataris. In the United States, or neither the United States or Iran or Israel, there is anybody who is calling for the destruction of Iran. All what they calling for is containing it and to keep the so-called Shiite crescent to remain intact, to blackmailers. They want to downsize Iran so that it will not constitute a threat to Israel only. When the Gulf countries declared holy war in Afghanistan, they did not dare to do the same. They did not dare to do the same in Syria. Some Shiites, under the blessing of the American Israeli blessing, entered that jihad. In the name of God, first of all, thank you to all the panelists. My question to Dr. Dhafer, then Dr. Miller, then Dr. Mahjoob. Dr. Dhafer, by the balance of power, do you mean a balance of power between the US and Iran in the region? And if the Americans depart this area, will there be a Chinese or Indian replacement of the American rule? We have to distinguish our foes from our friends. Since the terrorist attacks in the United States in 2001, Dr. Miller, no terrorist activities took part in the United States which had anything to do with Iran. All the terrorist attacks were by Sunni Muslims. Dr. Mahjoob, we know that America handed Iraq over to Iran. So the Iranian presence within Iran was by America's blessings, and also Iran's extensions in Syria, Hezbollah in Iran and Yemen, all of this were with America's blessings. What happened with the Saudi military campaign had nothing to do with any Shiite expansionism, but it had everything to do with Saudi and UAE designs on the area. And also in Qatar, all what we aim for is a dialogue with Iran. We can't hear the moderator without a microphone. We will get now one round of replies, and maybe we come back if we have time. We started with the right, now we start with the left with Dr. Mahjoob. In the U.S.-American relations, and after years of researching this issue, I don't think America and the U.S. U.S. and Iran are not able to deal with each other. I think they can, and the nuclear deal was a good testimony to that. I think we need, as academics, to say something which probably may not be liked by some people, but nonetheless we have to say it. The U.S. and Iran managed to manage their relations and the tensions between them for many, many years. When Trump came to power and he cancelled the nuclear deal, this does not mean that everything is dead and buried. For this reason, I think the real blame should be placed on the other side. The other side, by that I mean the Gulf countries, how they can define their own interests in a manner which enables them to deal both with the United States and Iran. 40 years of blaming Iran, and Iran did not do anything but achieve better advancement at the expense of Arab. I don't think it was positive. I think when they go to interfere in Iraq or Yemen, this is not progress, this is destruction. But anyway, let's assume that, as they say, they are spreading their influence. I think we as intellectuals should make it clear to politicians that Iran irritates the Arab side, they disregard the Arab interests. I think Iran is weaker now than how it was in 2010, and the decision makers in the Arab world, especially in the Orient, they should know that Iran is no longer the same as Iran. Iran lost any support it had in 2010, 2011. Anybody who believed in the Arab Spring and peaceful change can no longer tolerate Iran or accept Iran. Everybody has a negative view of Iran, even if the governments manage to solve their problems with Iran. I think public opinion will always be against it. This is an opportunity which can be invested in. The Gulf is exposed security-wise, as some colleagues said, and the Gulf countries until now have not identified their foes from their friends. Countries which want to survive and continue and leave an impression on the world do not jump all over the place and ignore their friends and start committing mistakes. We saw some unbelievable attitudes between friends and brotherly countries. I remember an Iranian diplomat saying to me once in Paris, he said, Iran goes through the best period of its history because we receive intelligence appraisals from 22 Arab capitals. This kind of, maybe some kind of bragging, but nonetheless, when it comes to the nuclear deal, it's true that the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia specifically, viewed the nuclear deal as an abandonment by the U.S. administration and an act of treason, a stab in the back, and considered that all what Saudi Arabia has made for the United States ended up with America treating it like this, and for this reason, from the first moment of Trump's winning the elections, Saudi Arabia started finding in Trump a person who will represent its interests positively, and the UAE also, maybe they were the only two countries who expressed their delight at canceling the nuclear deal, but we did not hear similar attitudes from other Gulf countries. This reinforces the idea of division within the GCC.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zweiri.
Just to add to what the first speaker said, about how has the GCC evolved and has it been separated from the rest of the Arab world? I work on regional organizations, and if you look at the early days of the GCC, one of the main preoccupations of the leadership was how do you set up this organization and emphasize that you're not separating yourself from the rest of the Arab world. And there was a lot of consideration given to that in the early days. They wanted to say we are strengthening one flank of the Arab world rather than separating from the wider Arab world. Of course, realities have been different because, on almost every measure, the Gulf states are far ahead of the Arab world in terms of human development now, in terms of internet access, in terms of education, and so on, life expectancy. And so on one level, structurally, they are increasingly separate from much of the Arab world, but they've tried very hard. And then strategically, in the late 2000s, you see that they're becoming separate from the Arab world again in terms of what used to be called the frontline states. Syria, Iraq, Egypt. They were taking the lead away from in the strategic and security field where they had already gone way ahead in the socio-economic field. So it is an issue. To answer the question about power, the issue of power is how do you measure power? And I would say that the two or three most useful measures in context of the US on the global level and on the regional level, the first is in terms of instruments of power, because power is, the instruments of power is only a way of achieving your strategic ends. And the most important ones are economic, military, diplomatic, and I guess you could even say social cohesion at home. And I think it's fair to say that on every one of those four issues, the United States now is weaker, or at least the power differential is closed. Economic, on military, and social cohesion at home, it's very divided, and on diplomatic influence. So then it's for all of us to decide which one of them matters most. Obviously, in the military context, they're much greater than the others. The economic power differential has shrunk much more, so then you have to place a value on which of them is more important, which leads to the second measure of power, which is, do you achieve your objectives? And can you provide leadership? And how much do others take you into account before they act? And so you could argue, if you take a particular issue like Syria, did they achieve their objectives? No. Did they demonstrate leadership? No. Did others take them into account before they acted? No. So relatively, they are still the most powerful, but on key issues in many regions at different times, their power is definitely shrinking. And then the third aspect of that is legitimacy and political will. There's no doubt that the United States is much more powerful by every measure than Russia. But Russia could use its political will and in some contexts its legitimacy to achieve its goals, demonstrate leadership, and get others to take them into account. So when you look at it in those terms, it's up to you to decide. And then the final point I'd make about the 2001 terror attacks, and they've all been from the Sunni world, not from Iran, but that's because the relationships that these actors have wanted to break are the ones between the Sunni leadership and the United States. And so, interestingly, when 9/11 happened, that was the main narrative in Saudi Arabia. Don't blame us, that's what these people want you to do. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
The values of America. Yeah, look, I'm an IR person, so, justice and equity don't really come into it usually, but what I would say is you could argue in terms of power, democracy or democracy promotion in this region has been detrimental to U.S. power, George Bush Sr. died yesterday or today, I think. I'm sure, he was a Cold War realist, and he achieved an awful lot in this region in consolidating and extending American power and setting the basis for the unilateral unipolar era. So what I'm saying, domestically, again, there are many areas where you could say that America is more democratic now in terms of the minorities and representation and so on a domestic level. Equitable? Well, every country, the gap between those who have and those who have not is growing. And I'm sure that by some measures, while the gap is massive in the United States, it's not any more massive than in European countries and other countries. So, and then in terms of values and justice, on an IR level, there's one argument that, you're not in the business of doing justice, you're in the business of maximizing your security. The problem is that when you try to maximize your security without taking the interests of others into account, they have less reason to follow you, and they look elsewhere. So, I'm no expert on domestic American politics, but, by one account, justice, equality, and democracy are on the up in the U.S. in very different ways, even like from below as well as from the top. So, but I'm not sure that factors into a U.S. role in this or any other region.
Thank you very much, دكتور. الآن ننتقل للدكتور ظافر العجمي. تفضل.
والله الظاهر بأذن فيكم الغرب ونصلي أبرك. إيش رأيكم؟
I think I will call for adhan or call for a prayer, Maghrib prayer, but the question about the strategic balance between who and who, I was very clear when I talked about that in the absence of American ability to strike a balance. I think the strategic balance between Iran and the Arab region is possible, and I provided solution, maybe primitive, deterrent, also establishing military or economic entities or bodies, and maybe we can move to an balance. Maybe we will resort to a nuclear umbrella or nuclear power to provide balance with Iran and to counter Iran. The other issue mentioned by my colleague regarding the division in the Gulf. So we have a different GCC. I think this stems from your desire. Yes, we are still existing as a GCC body despite the Qatari crisis. Yes, Qataris are still attending meetings at the GCC level. So as an entity, as a body, it still exists. So, and we are trying to maintain that to the last minute. Thank you very much. We will take 2 more questions. Thank you very much for the speakers who enriched this discussion, and thank you very much, Sheikh Suhaim, for moderating this session. I have a comment and I have direct questions to the speakers. My response or comment to Dr. Asharqawi when he wondered what kind of GCC we are talking about. Yes, definitely the GCC countries are one unit despite the changes in the circumstances and the crisis. We will still have an Arab Gulf region. So leadership will come and go, strategies will come and go, but at the end of the day, yes, we will have the GCC as one unifying body. My question to you, can the GCC tolerate new wars or conflicts after the first, second, third Gulf wars? Do we, maybe this will be very detrimental to us. This will lead to our self-destruction if we engage or allow new wars. So I think we are committing a self-destruction currently by enticing internal conflicts and disagreements to political disagreements. But we are blessed to be in a very common area. Iran is a geographic fact. We cannot destroy them. We cannot. So we need to look for shared objectives. We need to think about shared interests, and we need to resort our conflicts among us without allowing foreign powers to invade and involved. And so we see that, yes, Iran is spreading, and its footprints are in Syria, Iraq, Yemen. However, again, we need to reach some kind of a compromise, because we cannot tolerate a new war that could destroy us completely here in the Gulf region. This is my personal opinion. So please, if you have questions, ask questions, not comments. If you have a question about an issue very relevant to the topic of discussion that might shed light or enhance or enrich the discussions, I think that the time remaining does not allow for interjections and long comments. Good afternoon, peace be upon you. My name is Fahad Al-Marri, a PhD student in Security and Political Studies. My question about the main topic of this session, which talks about security issues, and we need not to forget the crisis of the killing of Mr. Khashoggi and its implication on the. It's very important to differentiate between the Gulf states and the GCC as a body. GCC body that is no longer exist after the crisis, and we are all look forward for the next GCC summit. We need to leave a margin of room to both the state of Kuwait and the Sultanate of Oman, who were not involved in the blockade in Qatar. So please, I implore you to ask questions. So my question, why we don't allow the Sultanate of Oman and the prudent leadership, in addition to the Kuwaiti mediation, to find a solution to the GCC crisis, because we are in a currently we are in a vicious circle that will not yield to any solution. My question to Rory Muller in this regard.
My question is to Mr. Rory. Is it correct to conclude from your discussion and the discussion of the other distinguished American speakers on the future of the Gulf, security of the Gulf, that the message you are sending here is actually a doomsday message for the Gulf? Because what I concluded from listening to all four of you is that the Gulf countries without the United States, after 40 years of working together with the U.S. and cooperating and building defense strategies and the missile programs and everything, is that the Gulf Cooperation Council does not have a defensive strategy. None of the Gulf countries have a true military capabilities and unreliable and cannot protect itself, and therefore prepare yourselves for doomsday after the U.S. exits the region in the coming 20 years, and Iran will be walking all over the Gulf state by state. This is the message I get from all of you, because I see no hope as a conclusion from your discussion for the region. Thank you.
شكرا. هل في سؤال آخر؟
Is there any other questions? Yes. My question to Dr. Mahjoob. You said that the role of Sultanate Oman, especially in trying to mediate between U.S. and Iran vis-a-vis the nuclear deal, it seems that Saudi Arabia consider that as deviating from the principles of the GCC. So my question to Dr. Mahjoob, don't you believe that this nuclear agreement or deal with Iran prevented the GCC country to enter into a nuclear arm race with Iran that will cost billions of dollars, especially they are dealing with this matter as separate individuals? So yes, such a deal, the GCOP, was very fundamental to the security of the Gulf states and prevented an escalation in the region. Now we ask Dr. Rory Miller to answer the question directly to him.
Look, you know, my view is this, and they're sort of, both questions are sort of interrelated. The reason that the GCC is not an effective or viable mechanism for mediation or negotiation right now is because the reason that member states of a regional organization use it for mediation or negotiation is because they want to demonstrate to themselves and others that it is a viable, legitimate organization and it provides alternative goals. In other words, if you have constant intra-GCC crises between members, it's going to reduce its effectiveness in other ways, as a security or economic actor. So if you care at being a security or economic actor, you use the mechanism to come to a compromise on your differences. And this happened all the way up until 2014. Okay, when you have the withdrawal of ambassadors briefly from Doha. Okay, now one of the reasons is this: the Saudis and the UAE do not care that the GCC functions as a viable mechanism for security or economics, and so they have no incentive to use it, to legitimize it, and to solve the intra-GCC disputes. If that changes, it can return to being that. The other parties to the GCC are not strong enough to bring them together and to sustain those negotiations. So that's the reason. You know, and there's quite a bit of work being done. How do you move from conflict to negotiation in a regional organization? This crisis is quite illuminating. You have to want the organization to survive and to prosper in order to take it seriously enough to deal with it. I'm not doomsday. In fact, I would like to think that the subliminal message of my presentation was that the GCC has achieved an awful lot that people don't give it credit for. Okay? It's been super resilient. You know, the AMU in North Africa basically fell apart after the 1991 Gulf War. It has managed to sustain itself in a very unstable, wider area with many aspiring hegemons creating it problems and many differences between each other. So that's the first point. The second point is, you know, the dominant explanation for why things look a bit depressing now is because two member states have decided that this does not serve its purpose. So that is the reason. It's not about the US, it's not even an external function of this, you know. As I said to you, I think the key point would be this. If the Saudis and the UAE from June of 2017, which was really the abandonment of the GCC, if they had showed Washington that we have an alternative that is effective, I don't think they'd mind particularly. But they failed to show them we have an alternative that is effective, and so the US are doing what the dominant actor does, finding ways to go back to the status quo to protect its interests. So, you know, I don't think it's a doomsday scenario. I think it's very far from that. But I think it's up to the local actors to find an alternative mechanism to provide defense and security and then bring each other together. Because I think this offensive path that two of the major players in the region are going down is a recipe for broader disaster going forward.
Thank you very much. تفضل الدكتور محجوب. أنا بالتأكيد لا أختلف معك.
Yes, indeed, I do agree with you that the nuclear deal with Iran was an opportunity that considered internationally as a way to prevent the area at large from a new escalation and new war. However, my comment focused on because of the division in the area, we did not deal, or the GCC countries did not deal with this agreement as an opportunity, but they looked at it as a threat. So we did not build on the agreement to serve the interests of the GCC, especially by Saudi Arabia, who looked at the agreement as an abandonment of the United States that could hamper the interests of the GCC countries. And in the past 5 years, the GCC countries are following the policy that has been adopted by Iran over the 40 years. So the GCC countries has involved in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, on the belief that nobody can stop them. So they took the green light from the United States and engaged in the war in Yemen and led to what it has led. So the involvement in Yemen was started on the pretext that this comes in line with the efforts to confront terrorism by the Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Yemen. So again, I stress the point that Saudi Arabia and UAE are following the same strategy adopted by Iran over the past 4 decades. And in the conclusion of this session, I would like to thank you and thank the panelists for their invaluable contributions. By this, we conclude the today's sessions, hoping to see you in the morning.